The morning mist hung low over the Tuscan hills as Niccolò Machiavelli sat in his study, quill poised over parchment, contemplating the fundamental nature of power and self-transformation. The year was 1513, and the former secretary to the Florentine Republic had witnessed the rise and fall of princes, the brutal efficiency of Cesare Borgia, and the catastrophic weakness of those who failed to adapt to the harsh realities of political life. In his mind crystallized a truth that would echo through centuries: the greatest enemy of any leader is not external opposition, but internal weakness, and only through ruthless self-destruction and reconstruction could one achieve true dominance. This principle of deliberate self-annihilation and rebirth forms the cornerstone of what we might call Machiavellian reinvention, a process so thorough and uncompromising that it transforms not merely one's tactics or appearance, but the very essence of one's character and capabilities. It is a philosophy born from the observation that those who cling to their comfortable weaknesses, their familiar limitations, and their cherished but ineffective habits inevitably fall prey to those who have undergone the painful process of complete metamorphosis. The first phase of Machiavellian reinvention begins with what might be called the archaeology of weakness, a merciless excavation of one's own limitations, blind spots, and comfortable delusions. Machiavelli understood that most individuals live in elaborate self-deceptions, constructing narratives that protect their ego while simultaneously ensuring their continued mediocrity. The process of genuine transformation requires not gentle self-improvement, but violent self-examination that leaves no stone unturned, no excuse unchallenged, no comfortable lie intact. Consider the case of Francesco Sforza, whom Machiavelli admired for his transformation from mercenary captain to Duke of Milan. Sforza's reinvention began with a brutal assessment of his position. He was landless, titleless, and dependent entirely on his military skills in an era where military success alone was insufficient for lasting power. Rather than accepting these limitations or gradually working within them, Sforza systematically identified and eliminated every aspect of his identity that constrained his ambitions. He abandoned the comfortable role of hired sword, rejected the security of serving under established powers, and embarked on a campaign of conquest that required him to become not just a better soldier, but a diplomat, administrator, and political strategist. The archaeological process demands that one approach their own weaknesses with the same dispassionate analysis that a general applies to enemy fortifications. Machiavelli advocated for what he called the mirror of necessity, a practice of examining one's failures not through the lens of excuses or external circumstances, but as direct reflections of internal inadequacies. When a negotiation fails, the question is not whether the other party was unreasonable, but what specific weaknesses in one's own preparation, presentation, or character created the conditions for failure. When an opportunity is missed, the analysis focuses not on timing or luck, but on the habits of mind and patterns of behavior that prevented recognition and action. This process extends beyond mere professional or strategic weaknesses to encompass the entire architecture of one's personality. Machiavelli observed that most people are slaves to their emotional patterns, their social conditioning, and their unconscious habits of thought and behavior. The man who becomes angry when challenged will always be vulnerable to those who understand how to provoke him. The woman who needs approval will always be manipulated by those who control the mechanisms of social validation. The leader who cannot tolerate uncertainty will always be outmaneuvered by those comfortable with ambiguity and risk. The archaeological phase requires developing what Machiavelli termed the observer's eye, the ability to watch oneself with the same detached scrutiny one might apply to a political rival. This involves tracking patterns across multiple contexts and situations, identifying the consistent threads that connect various failures and limitations. Perhaps one discovers a tendency to defer to authority figures, revealing a deep-seated need for approval that compromises independent judgment. Or one might recognize a pattern of avoiding difficult conversations, suggesting an underlying fear of conflict that prevents effective leadership. The process becomes particularly challenging when it reveals the gap between one's self-image and one's actual effectiveness. Many individuals operate under the delusion that their intentions, their values, or their theoretical knowledge somehow translate automatically into real-world results. The archaeology of weakness demolishes these comfortable fantasies by forcing a confrontation with measurable outcomes. It asks not what one believes about themselves, but what their actual track record demonstrates about their capabilities and limitations. Machiavelli understood that this phase of self-examination must be conducted with absolute honesty, especially when, the discoveries are uncomfortable or ego-threatening. He recommended what he called the counselor's mirror, imagining how a brutally honest advisor would assess one's strengths and weaknesses if their own survival depended on giving accurate counsel. This exercise often reveals that one's perceived strengths are actually sources of vulnerability, while genuine strengths remain underdeveloped or unrecognized. The archaeological process also involves examining the social and professional environments that have shaped one's development. Machiavelli recognized that individuals often develop elaborate coping mechanisms and defensive strategies that serve them well in specific contexts but become liabilities when circumstances change. The executive who learned to succeed in a bureaucratic environment may have developed habits of risk aversion and committee-based decision-making that proved disastrous in entrepreneurial contexts. The academic who excelled in theoretical analysis may have atrophied their capacity for rapid, practical decision-making under pressure. This environmental analysis extends to relationships and social networks, recognizing that one's circle of associates often reinforces existing limitations rather than challenging them to grow. The archaeology of weakness asks uncomfortable questions: which relationships provide comfort at the expense of growth? Which social groups reward mediocrity while punishing excellence? Which professional contexts encourage the very weaknesses that must be eliminated? The final aspect of the archaeological phase involves what Machiavelli called the inventory of illusions, cataloging the various self-serving narratives and cognitive biases that prevent clear thinking and effective action. These might include the belief that good intentions matter more than results, the assumption that others will reciprocate fairness and honesty, or the conviction that gradual improvement is sufficient in competitive environments. Each illusion must be identified, examined, and ultimately discarded if genuine transformation is to occur. As this first phase nears completion, the individual begins to see themselves with unprecedented clarity, not as they wish to be seen, not as they have been conditioned to see themselves, but as they actually are in terms of measurable capabilities and consistent patterns of behavior. This revelation is rarely pleasant. It often produces what Machiavelli described as the dark night of recognition, a period of profound discomfort as comfortable self-deceptions crumble and the true scope of necessary change becomes apparent. Yet this discomfort is not a sign of failure but of progress. The archaeological phase serves as the necessary foundation for everything that follows. Without a clear understanding of what must be destroyed, reconstruction becomes impossible. Without acknowledging the true extent of one's limitations, transformation remains superficial. The individual who skips or rushes through this phase of brutal self-assessment will find their efforts at reinvention undermined by the very weaknesses they failed to identify and eliminate. The completion of the archaeological phase marks a crucial transition point. Having identified the weaknesses that must be destroyed, having catalogued the illusions that must be abandoned, and having mapped the environmental factors that must be changed, the individual stands at the threshold of the second phase, the systematic destruction of their weak self through deliberate metamorphosis. Part 2, The Forge of Metamorphosis. The second phase of Machiavellian reinvention involves what can only be described as controlled self-destruction, a deliberate and systematic process of dismantling the weak aspects of one's personality, habits, and worldview to create space for something entirely new. This is not the gentle evolution of self-help literature, nor the gradual improvement advocated by conventional wisdom. It is, instead, a violent rupture with one's existing self, conducted with the same ruthless efficiency that Machiavelli admired in successful princes who conquered new territories by completely destroying existing power structures. The metaphor of the forge is particularly apt for this phase. Just as steel must be heated to extreme temperatures and hammered repeatedly to achieve its final form, the human character must be subjected to intense pressure and deliberate stress to break free from the limitations of its current configuration. The process is necessarily painful, disorienting, and often terrifying, as it requires abandoning familiar patterns of thought and behavior even before their replacements have been fully developed. Machiavelli studied this process in the career of Lorenzo de' Medici, who transformed himself from a young banker with artistic inclinations into one of the most formidable political operators of his era. Lorenzo's metamorphosis began with a deliberate rejection of his natural temperament. Where he was inclined toward philosophical reflection, he forced himself into the brutal world of Florentine politics. Where he preferred aesthetic pursuits, he immersed himself in military strategy and financial manipulation. Whereas education had prepared him for scholarly discourse, he developed the capacity for decisive action under pressure. The forge of metamorphosis operates through what Machiavelli termed systematic contradiction, the deliberate cultivation of capabilities that directly oppose one's natural inclinations and comfortable patterns. If one's weakness lies in avoiding conflict, the metamorphosis requires actively seeking confrontational situations until comfort with conflict becomes second nature. If the limitation involves decision-making paralysis, the transformation demands making rapid decisions in high-stakes situations until quick judgment becomes automatic. This systematic contradiction extends beyond mere behavior modification to encompass fundamental changes in identity and worldview. The individual undergoing Machiavellian reinvention must be prepared to abandon cherished beliefs about themselves, their values, and their place in the world if those beliefs serve as obstacles to effectiveness. The kind manager must learn when kindness becomes weakness. The honest negotiator must develop comfort with strategic deception. The collaborative leader must master the arts of manipulation and control. The process requires what Machiavelli called the discipline of discomfort, deliberately placing oneself in situations that challenge existing capabilities and force the development of new ones. This might involve accepting leadership roles that exceed one's current competence, entering competitive environments where failure is likely, or engaging with individuals who expose one's intellectual or strategic limitations. The key principle is that growth occurs only at the edges of one's comfort zone, and significant transformation requires pushing far beyond those edges into territory that feels genuinely threatening. Physical transformation often serves as both symbol and catalyst for deeper change. Machiavelli observed that many successful leaders underwent dramatic changes in their physical presentation, dress, and demeanor as external manifestations of internal metamorphosis. Cesare Borgia, for example, cultivated an appearance of controlled menace that served both to intimidate opponents and to remind himself of his transformed nature. The physical transformation serves as a constant reinforcement of the new identity being created, making it more difficult to retreat into old patterns of behavior. The forge phase also requires what might be called strategic isolation, temporarily withdrawing from social and professional environments that reinforce existing limitations. Just as a sword cannot be properly forged while still attached to the raw metal from which it came, personal transformation often requires separation from the relationships, contexts, and feedback loops that maintain current patterns. This isolation is not permanent, but it creates the psychological space necessary for fundamental change to occur. During this isolation, the individual engages in what Machiavelli termed the laboratory of identity, systematic experimentation with new ways of thinking, behaving, and relating to others. This experimentation must be conducted with scientific rigor, carefully observing the results of different approaches and adjusting based on effectiveness rather than comfort or moral preference. The question is never whether a particular behavior feels natural or aligns with previous values, but whether it produces the desired outcomes in the real world of power and competition. The laboratory phase often involves studying and systematically emulating individuals who have already achieved the transformation one seeks. Machiavelli himself engaged in this process through his intensive study of historical figures, analyzing not just their strategies and tactics, but their patterns of thought, their decision-making processes, and their fundamental approaches to human nature and political reality. The individual undergoing metamorphosis must similarly identify role models who embody the capabilities they seek to develop and engage in detailed study of how those individuals think and operate. This emulation process goes far beyond surface-level imitation to involve what might be called cognitive archaeology, attempting to understand and adopt the mental models, assumptions, and thought processes that enable superior performance. How does a master negotiator approach preparation differently? What assumptions about human nature guide a successful leader's decision-making? How does an effective strategist process information and identify patterns that others miss? The metamorphosis requires not just copying external behaviors, but rewiring the internal cognitive and emotional systems that generate those behaviors. The forge phase also demands what Machiavelli called the destruction of comfortable truths, abandoning beliefs and assumptions that, while perhaps morally satisfying or psychologically comforting, serve as obstacles to effectiveness. This might involve accepting that most human behavior is driven by self-interest rather than altruism, that fairness is often less important than results, or that good intentions do not guarantee positive outcomes. Each comfortable truth that is abandoned creates space for more realistic and strategically useful beliefs to take root. Perhaps most challenging is what Machiavelli termed the murder of the previous self, a conscious rejection of previous identity markers, personality traits, and behavioral patterns that must be eliminated to make room for new ones. This process often involves a period of profound disorientation, as the individual exists in a liminal state between their old self, which has been systematically dismantled, and their new self, which has not yet fully emerged. During this period, they may feel like actors playing roles that don't yet feel natural, or like imposters attempting to inhabit identities they haven't yet earned. The emotional and psychological stress of this phase cannot be underestimated. The individual is simultaneously grieving the loss of their familiar self while struggling to inhabit an unfamiliar new identity. Old sources of validation and comfort are no longer available, while new ones have not yet been established. The temptation to retreat into familiar patterns becomes intense, particularly when the new behaviors initially produce worse results than the old ones, as is often the case during the learning curve of any significant skill development. Success in the forge phase requires what Machiavelli called the discipline of persistence, continuing the transformation process even when it feels unnatural, produces initial failures, or generates criticism from others. This persistence must be coupled with the intelligence of adaptation, the ability to adjust and refine the transformation based on feedback and results while maintaining commitment to the overall process of change. The completion of the forge phase is marked not by comfort or mastery, but by what Machiavelli described as the recognition of fundamental change, a clear awareness that one's basic patterns of thought and behavior have been permanently altered. The individual recognizes that they can no longer easily access their previous way of being, even if they wanted to. The old self has been sufficiently destroyed that retreat is no longer an option. This recognition serves as the transition point to the third and final phase of Machiavellian reinvention, the systematic construction and deployment of the new self in the pursuit of dominance and control. Having destroyed what was weak and forged new capabilities through intense pressure and practice, the individual is now ready to emerge from their metamorphosis and engage with the world from a position of transformed strength. Part 3, The Architecture of Dominance. The final phase of Machiavellian reinvention involves the systematic construction and deployment of the newly forged self in pursuit of strategic dominance. Having completed the archaeological work of identifying weaknesses and the forge work of destroying and rebuilding fundamental aspects of character and capability, the individual now faces the challenge of architecting a coherent system of power and influence that leverages their transformation. This phase requires moving beyond personal development to strategic positioning, from individual strength to systemic control. The architecture of dominance begins with what Machiavelli called the mapping of force fields, a comprehensive analysis of the power dynamics, influence networks, and competitive landscapes within which the newly transformed individual will operate. Unlike the inward focus of the previous phases, this stage demands external awareness and strategic thinking about how to position oneself advantageously within existing systems while simultaneously working to reshape those systems to one's benefit. The process starts with identifying what Machiavelli termed leverage points, specific positions, relationships, or capabilities that provide disproportionate influence over outcomes. These might be formal positions of authority, but more often they involve less obvious sources of power, control over information flows, relationships with key decision makers, expertise in critical areas, or the ability to solve problems that others cannot. The transformed individual must systematically identify and pursue these leverage points, understanding that true dominance rarely comes from obvious sources of power but from controlling the less visible mechanisms that actually drive results. Consider how Machiavelli himself exemplified this principle during his service to the Florentine Republic. While he never held the highest formal offices, he achieved remarkable influence through his control over diplomatic communications, his expertise in military affairs, and his relationships with key foreign powers. His dominance came not from his title but from his unique ability to analyze and influence the strategic dynamics that shaped Florence's survival and prosperity. The architecture phase requires developing what might be called strategic patience, the ability to pursue long-term positioning even when short-term gains are available. The newly transformed individual must resist the temptation to immediately exploit their enhanced capabilities for quick victories, instead focusing on building sustainable systems of influence and control that will compound over time. This often means accepting subordinate positions temporarily while building the capabilities and relationships necessary for eventual dominance. Central to this strategic patience is the development of what Machiavelli called the intelligence network, a systematic approach to gathering, processing, and acting on information that provides competitive advantages. The architecture of dominance requires superior information processing capabilities, as strategic advantage increasingly depends on understanding patterns and opportunities that others miss. This involves not just collecting information, but developing sophisticated analytical frameworks for interpreting that information and identifying actionable insights. The intelligence network extends beyond formal information gathering to include what Machiavelli termed human instrumentation, the systematic development of relationships that provide access to decision makers, early warning of threats and opportunities, and channels for influence that bypass formal hierarchies. The transformed individual must become skilled at identifying and cultivating relationships with individuals who possess complementary capabilities, strategic positions, or valuable resources. This human instrumentation requires mastery of what modern psychology might call social intelligence, but with a distinctly Machiavellian edge. The focus is not on being liked or building warm relationships, but on creating strategic alliances based on mutual benefit and shared interests. The newly transformed individual must learn to identify what each potential ally values most and position themselves as uniquely capable of providing those benefits while extracting maximum value from the relationship. The architecture phase also demands the development of what Machiavelli called systematic reputation management, the deliberate cultivation of specific perceptions among different audiences to maximize strategic advantage. This is not about creating a false image, but about emphasizing different aspects of one's capabilities and character to different groups based on what will be most strategically useful. To competitors, one might emphasize unpredictability and dangerous competence. To potential allies, one might emphasize reliability and mutual benefit. To superiors, one might emphasize competence and loyalty. This reputation management requires understanding that perception often matters more than reality in determining outcomes, and that different audiences require different approaches. The individual who has successfully completed the forge phase of transformation now possesses a broader range of capabilities and can authentically present different aspects of their personality to different audiences based on strategic considerations rather than personal comfort. Perhaps most critically, the architecture phase requires what Machiavelli termed the construction of inevitability, systematically positioning oneself so that others naturally turn to them when problems arise or opportunities emerge. This involves becoming genuinely indispensable through the development of unique capabilities, the control of critical resources, or the cultivation of exclusive relationships. The goal is to create situations where others have little choice but to work with and through the transformed individual if they want to achieve their own objectives. The construction of inevitability often involves what might be called strategic specialization, becoming exceptionally competent in areas that others find difficult or undesirable but that provide significant leverage over outcomes. This might involve developing expertise in crisis management, complex negotiations, or the navigation of regulatory environments. The key is to identify areas where exceptional competence provides strategic advantage and where few others are willing to invest the effort necessary to compete effectively. The architecture phase also requires mastery of what Machiavelli called the timing of revelation, knowing when to display one's capabilities and when to conceal them for maximum strategic effect. The individual who has undergone successful transformation now possesses capabilities that may surprise those who knew them in their previous incarnation. The strategic deployment of these surprises can provide significant advantages in negotiations, competitions, and conflicts. This timing consideration extends to what might be called escalation management, the ability to gradually increase pressure or display increased capability in response to resistance or competition. The newly transformed individual must learn to calibrate their responses to challenges, using only as much force or capability as necessary to achieve objectives while keeping additional resources in reserve for future needs. The final aspect of the architecture phase involves what Machiavelli termed the institutionalization of advantage, creating systems, processes, and structures that preserve and extend one's dominance beyond individual effort. This might involve building teams or organizations that amplify one's capabilities, establishing processes that funnel opportunities toward oneself, or creating systems that make it difficult for competitors to challenge one's position effectively. The institutionalization of advantage requires thinking beyond personal power to systemic influence. The truly successful transformation culminates not just in individual dominance, but in the creation of structures that perpetuate and extend that dominance over time. This might involve mentoring and developing others who become extensions of one's influence, creating standards or processes that favor one's particular capabilities, or establishing relationships and partnerships that create barriers to competition. Throughout this architecture phase, the individual must maintain what Machiavelli called the warrior's vigilance, constant awareness that dominance attracts challenge and that competitors will adapt their strategies in response to one's success. The architecture of dominance must therefore include defensive elements, early warning systems for emerging threats, contingency plans for various forms of attack or competition, and the flexibility to adapt strategies as circumstances change. The successful completion of the architecture phase results in what Machiavelli would recognize as true strategic dominance, a position where one's transformed capabilities, strategic positioning, and systematic influence create sustainable competitive advantages that compound over time. The individual has moved beyond personal transformation to become a force that shapes their environment rather than merely responding to it. This dominance is characterized not by the absence of challenges or competition, but by the capability to consistently outmaneuver competitors and turn obstacles into opportunities. The transformed individual has become what Machiavelli might call anti-fragile, not merely resilient in the face of stress and challenge, but actually strengthened by adversity that would weaken less thoroughly transformed competitors. The ultimate validation of successful Machiavellian reinvention is the recognition that one has become the type of person that others must account for in their own strategic planning. The transformed individual has achieved a position where they cannot be ignored, cannot be easily bypassed, and cannot be destroyed by the conventional means that might have been effective against their previous, weaker self. As the process reaches its culmination, the individual realizes the truth of Machiavelli's fundamental insight: the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has already done the work of destruction more thoroughly than any external enemy could accomplish. Having identified and eliminated his own weaknesses, having forged new capabilities through deliberate stress and challenge, and having systematically built structures of sustainable influence and control, he has achieved a form of strategic invulnerability that comes not from avoiding challenges, but from being better prepared to meet them than any competitor could possibly be. The transformation is complete not when the individual feels comfortable or satisfied, but when they have achieved what Machiavelli called the luxury of strategic choice, the ability to shape circumstances rather than merely respond to them, to create opportunities rather than merely exploit them, and to determine the terms of engagement rather than merely compete within frameworks established by others. This is the true meaning of dominance in the Machiavellian sense, not the temporary superiority that comes from favorable circumstances or inherited advantages, but the sustainable strategic superiority that emerges from systematic self-transformation and the intelligent application of enhanced capabilities to the pursuit of lasting influence and control. In the end, the individual who has successfully completed this three-phase process of ruthless reinvention emerges as something qualitatively different from what they were before, not merely improved or developed, but fundamentally transformed in ways that create permanent advantages in the eternal competition for power, influence, and control that defines human interaction at its most fundamental level.